They arrested him, mocked him, and called him a threat. But when he revealed who he really was, everything changed. This isn't just a story of injustice, it's a story of power. Silence, wow. And the moment truth exploded in a courtroom. The streets of Jackson Heights were quiet that night, the kind of stillness only broken by the buzz of aging streetlights. Malcolm Irons, a veteran federal prosecutor, had just left a dinner honoring a retiring judge. Dressed in a charcoal suit, tie loosened, he was thinking about little more than getting home and unwinding. Then came the flashing lights. Red and blue flooded his rearview mirror. Malcolm blinked, surprised. He hadn't been speeding. No stops missed. The car was recently serviced. Still, he exhaled and pulled over, his fingers moving calmly to retrieve his license. From his side mirror, he watched two officers approach. One was tall and built like a linebacker, Officer Doyle. The other was wiry, twitchy. Officer Burns' license and registration. Doyle barked. Malcolm handed them over. "Can I ask what this is about?" Doyle glanced at Burns. "Taillights out." "It wasn't. I had the vehicle inspected last week. Everything was cleared." Doyle leaned in. "Step out of the car, sir." Malcolm's heart sank, not from fear but from familiarity. He'd prosecuted traffic stops like this, and now it was his turn. "I'm not stepping out until you tell me why," Malcolm said. Evenly, Burns chuckled, tapping his belt. "Because we said so." Malcolm's mind raced. He had lectured on this Fourth Amendment rights, unlawful detainment, probable cause. But knowing the law didn't always protect you from its enforcers, "I'm within my rights to ask," he said, keeping his tone controlled. Doyle didn't respond. Instead, he opened the door with one hand and grabbed Malcolm's wrist with the other. "What the hell?" Malcolm shouted, jerking instinctively. Doyle pulled harder. The seatbelt snapped tight across Malcolm's chest. Burns came around the passenger side and twisted Malcolm's other arm behind his back. In seconds, metal cuffs clamped against bone. "You're resisting," Doyle muttered. Malcolm's back slammed onto the hood of his car. Cold steel bit into his skin. The fury inside him boiled. They didn't know who he was yet. At the precinct, Malcolm sat, cuffed to a bench, blood still rushing in his ears. No phone call, no questions. Just a blur of fingerprints, forms and indifference charges. Resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct. It was absurd, fabricated. A performance meant to justify their force. An officer in plain clothes walked by, pausing at the name on the intake sheet. His brows furrowed. "You're Malcolm Irons?" he asked. "That's right." The man's expression changed, but he said nothing. Just walked away. Later that night, Malcolm was released on bond. He stepped into the humid night, cuffs removed, but dignity bruised. A public defender would be assigned, he was told. He smiled grimly. "Let them assign one. Then watch what happens next." The courtroom was full, press clerks and a curious public. The judge, Meredith Lang, known for her cold efficiency, sat unmoved behind the bench. Prosecutor Leo Trent, sharp-suited and smug, opened the proceedings with confidence. "This is a textbook case," Trent began. A traffic stop turned violent by an uncooperative civilian. At the defense table, Malcolm sat silently next to his court-appointed attorney, Anna Morales, a young woman with weary eyes and a determined jaw. Anna stood. There is no body cam footage, no dash cam, just two contradictory officer statements. "Objection," Trent interrupted. "They're consistent." "Conveniently," Anna replied. Judge Lang raised a brow, but said nothing. Malcolm watched Officer Doyle smirk from the witness box. They thought they had this in the bag. He waited. Timing was everything. Officer Burns took the stand next. His testimony mirrored Doyle's almost word for word. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Lies, all of it. When Anna called Malcolm to testify, the room tensed. He walked to the stand with the poise of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Anna began. "Did you comply with officer instructions?" "I asked why I was being removed from my car." Malcolm replied. "That's not illegal." Trent rolled his eyes. "So you refused." "I invoked my rights," Malcolm said. "They responded with force." Trent stepped forward, smug. "Your Honor, we're wasting time." The defendant. Malcolm raised his hand. "Before we continue, I have something to disclose." All eyes turned. He reached into his bag and placed a badge on the desk. "My name is Malcolm Irons, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Eastern District." The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Lang looked up for the first time. The badge gleamed under courtroom lights. For a moment, nobody moved. Judge Lang's gavel hovered above her desk, then slowly lowered. Prosecutor Trent's smirk evaporated. Officer Burns looked like he'd seen a ghost. Doyle's jaw twitched. Assistant U.S. Attorney. Judge Lang repeated, her voice tight. Malcolm nodded. That's correct. I've been with the Eastern District for 11 years. Oversaw federal prosecutions of civil rights violations, public corruption, and you guessed it, false arrests. The silence fractured. Trent tried to recover. Your Honor, this was not disclosed to the prosecution. No, Malcolm said calmly, because I wanted to see how far they'd take the lie. Now we know. Burns visibly shifted. Doyle looked down. Anna turned to the judge. Given this revelation, we request a review of police dispatch logs and officer histories. Trent stammered. This is a publicity stunt? Judge Lang raised her hand. Request granted. It was no longer about traffic stops or courtroom etiquette. The courtroom had become a minefield, and Malcolm had just stepped on the trigger. Word spread fast. By mid-afternoon, Malcolm's name trended online. Federal prosecutor exposes local officers in court. The clip of him revealing his badge was already viral, posted by a student journalist sitting quietly in the gallery. The Baton Heights Courthouse press office was overwhelmed. Local officials issued carefully neutral statements. We are monitoring the situation. But behind closed doors, panic set in. Judge Lang called a recess. In her chambers, she paced, files clutched to her chest. Trent knocked, entering without waiting. We need to contain this, Lang glared. You brought me a federal prosecutor in cuffs, and your witnesses lied. I didn't know, he snapped. You should have. Meanwhile, Anna sat with Malcolm in the hallway. What now? They'll try to bury it, Malcolm said, or throw someone under the bus. Anna studied him. You're not going to let that happen. He met her eyes. I didn't survive law school, the feds, and hostile courtrooms just to sit quietly now. He turned his phone over. Notifications exploded. Journalists, colleagues, civil rights groups, all watching. And Malcolm was just getting started. The next day, Judge Lang reconvened court, but something had shifted. She no longer looked through Malcolm like he was an inconvenience. Now she regarded him like a problem, too complex to ignore. The bailiff called order. Trent's voice had lost its earlier swagger. Your Honor, given new disclosures, the prosecution is reevaluating. Too late, Anna cut in. We've filed a motion to dismiss, and we're submitting 3 exhibits. Police protocol violations, false statements, and a detailed timeline from Mr. Irons. Trent opened his mouth to object. Additionally, Anna continued, we request access to prior complaint files against Officers Doyle and Burns. Judge Lang's eyebrows lifted. In the gallery, Malcolm spotted a few unfamiliar faces. Activists, legal observers, and at least 2 journalists from national outlets. The fuse had reached the powder. Burns shifted nervously. Doyle stared straight ahead. Unmoving, Malcolm whispered to Anna. They never thought this would happen. That someone with power would stand up right in the middle of their playbook. Anna whispered back, then let's rewrite it. 2 days later, the court subpoenaed the full dispatch log. What it revealed exploded everything. There was no record of a traffic stop being called in at the time of Malcolm's arrest. No request for backup. No mention of a taillight violation. Instead, audio showed that Burns had radioed in an hour earlier, saw a guy in a Benz acting suspicious. Judge Lang listened to the tape herself. The courtroom was silent. As the recording echoed off the walls, Malcolm sat still. He had heard these kinds of tapes before, always used against others. Now it proved his innocence. Anna stood, Your Honor. The officers lied under oath. There was no probable cause, no safety concern, and certainly no legal justification for force. Lang rubbed her temples, jaw clenched. She knew this had grown beyond her courtroom. Trent rose slowly. The state moves to drop all charges. No, Malcolm interrupted. I want it on the record. I want every word said in this room preserved. The judge nodded, solemn. It was no longer just a defense. It was a reckoning. The next morning, news anchors called it the courtroom collapse in Baton Heights. Civil rights attorneys launched petitions. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, I am Malcolm Irons. Across social media, stories poured in. Black professionals, teachers, veterans, all with eerily similar experiences. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office scrambled. Internal Affairs opened a probe. The police union issued a defensive press release claiming the facts are still under review. But the truth was out. Anna met Malcolm at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He looked tired but determined. They'll come after your record now, she warned. Let them, he replied. They wanted to bury me, but I don't fit in shallow graves. Judge Lang, reviewing footage in her chambers, finally saw herself not as a neutral arbiter, but a cog in a system exposed on camera. In one moment, the illusion had shattered. and justice for once had begun to shift. Within 48 hours, the mayor of Jackson Heights faced a press storm. She tried to play neutral. "We're committed to transparency," but the people weren't buying it. Community leaders marched alongside law students and pastors. Local news gave way to CNN. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag justice for Malcolm. Hashtag no more routine. Stops. That same day, Anna received a message from the Department of Justice. Malcolm's case had triggered something bigger. They were opening a federal inquiry, not just into the arrest, but into systemic misconduct. Malcolm sat in his office at home watching the coverage. The face staring back on screen was his own, calm, composed, resolute. He received calls from former defendants thanking him. Some cried, others simply said, "You said what we never could." In court, Judge Lang scheduled a special hearing. This time, the entire courtroom was packed, not with routine attendees, but with people demanding accountability. And she knew this wasn't going away. Judge Lang called the hearing to order. Due to recent developments, she began this court as forwarding the full case record to the state attorney's office and the Department of Justice for external review. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Doyle's face turned beet red. Burns stared into his lap. Trent stood still, his hands clasped tight. Lang continued, "Further, this court acknowledges procedural failures that occurred not only during the arrest, but in the initial handling of this case." Malcolm sat still. Every word another layer stripped from the institution's armor. Outside reporters waited for a statement. He gave none. Later that evening, Malcolm drafted a personal letter addressed to his colleagues, his former professors, and civil rights attorneys across the country. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about every name that never made it to the courtroom. And every one of them deserves more than silence." He hit send. One by one, more stories emerged. A black teacher detained after a library visit, a teenager arrested for looking suspicious while jogging, a pregnant woman handcuffed in front of her children. Each name was now linked to the same officers, Doyle and Burns. Anna worked late into the night compiling evidence, sending affidavits to federal investigators. Malcolm reviewed reports, his legal mind a scalpel cutting through years of institutional fog. Meanwhile, the police chief held a tense press conference. "We do not condone misconduct," he said, "but we must let the investigation play out." But no one was waiting anymore. Civil rights organizations called for an emergency town hall. Anna and Malcolm were invited to speak. Standing before hundreds, Malcolm told them, "It's not about one badge or one courtroom. It's about who the system believes and who it punishes for asking questions." The room stood as one. It wasn't a rally, it was a signal. The silence had ended. Back in court, Judge Lang looked like a woman cornered by history. The world was watching. The hearing now public streamed live. "The court finds the defendant, Malcolm Irons, not guilty of all charges," she announced. A collective breath was released, but Malcolm didn't smile. "Not yet," she continued. "Additionally, the court recommends a full review of prior cases handled by the arresting officers and encourages oversight from federal authorities." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. As Malcolm stood, Anna touched his arm. "It's not over," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "but this time we're not alone." Outside cameras flashed, but this time they weren't hunting scandal. They were documenting history. 3 weeks later, Officers Doyle and Burns were suspended pending investigation. Trent was reassigned. Judge Lang was summoned by the State Judiciary Board. But Malcolm wasn't seeking revenge. He was seeking change. He accepted an invitation to guest lecture at Howard Law. His topic, power perception and prosecuting the truth. Anna joined a grassroots watchdog group training public defenders to challenge racial profiling cases. Meanwhile, lawsuits began to stack civil suits from others who had been falsely arrested, silenced, or worse. In the final moments of a town hall, an elderly man stood. "You gave us something back," he said. "You gave us a name that couldn't be ignored." Malcolm nodded. "It's not the badge," he replied. "It's what you choose to do when they try to take your voice." And with that, he stepped off the stage into a future still full of battles, but no longer fought alone. Inside the police department, cracks widened. Whistleblowers began to speak anonymously. One internal memo leaked to a local reporter exposed years of unofficial quotas, racially coded patrol assignments, and thinly veiled instructions. If he talks back, he goes in. The department scrambled to contain it, but screenshots, voice recordings, and scanned memos flooded the internet. Meanwhile, Malcolm was asked to testify in front of a state Senate committee reviewing misconduct in law enforcement. He accepted, but not to seek spotlight. He brought with him the names of 47 individuals with similar encounters, most buried in municipal courts and sealed records. He read their names aloud. Everyone across the aisle, even political rivals, fell silent. By the time he finished, no one saw him as just a prosecutor. They saw him as a reckoning. Protests turned into policy. Jackson Heights police chief resigned under pressure. Officer Doyle was indicted for perjury. Burns entered a plea deal offering to testify in exchange for immunity in unrelated internal affairs investigations. Judge Lang, under media fire and internal scrutiny, quietly submitted her resignation. The courthouse that once dismissed complaints now scrambled to reopen cases. But Malcolm refused to let the moment become a headline and disappear. He co-founded the Irons Justice Initiative, a nonprofit legal network, offering free representation to victims of racial profiling and wrongful arrest. Anna became its legal director. Every day they received letters, stories, evidence, pain wrapped in paper. Some from cities they'd never heard of. Others from people they'd unknowingly walked past every day. The work had only just begun. One afternoon, Malcolm received a letter not from a lawyer, but from a mother. Her son had been wrongfully jailed for resisting arrest. No body cam, no witnesses, just officer word against his. But after Malcolm's case, local advocates demanded the teen's release. The judge reversed the conviction. The boy walked free. "He talks about you like you're a superhero," the mother wrote. "But I know you're just a man who stood up when it counted." Malcolm placed the letter on his desk and stared out his office window. Somewhere a kid was getting off a bus. Somewhere else someone was being pulled over. He couldn't stop every injustice, but he could make sure the system no longer pretended it was blank. Months later, Malcolm stood on stage at the National Bar Association's annual Gala Justice. He said, "Isn't a courtroom decision. It's what happens when enough people refuse to sit quietly." He paused, the room hanging on his words. "I didn't ask to be arrested, but I did choose what to do with it." You don't have to be a federal prosecutor to demand change. You just have to show up, speak, refuse to vanish. The crowd stood in ovation. Some clapped, others cried. But all of them knew something real had shifted. Not because of a badge, because one man refused to be silent. In the months that followed, more departments nationwide adopted mandatory body cam laws. Several reopened wrongful conviction reviews. A congressional bill, the Community Stop Transparency Act, was introduced with Malcolm's testimony at the heart of its formation. The world hadn't fully changed, but the illusion of silence had shattered. On the anniversary of his arrest, Malcolm visited the courthouse alone. Not for revenge, not for media, just to stand in front of the place where everything broke open. He looked at the steps, the door, the sky above, and then he smiled just slightly, because somewhere inside someone was being told they didn't belong. And now that person had a path and a name to point to. True justice doesn't start when someone is found not guilty. It begins when the system is forced to confront its own reflection. One man's silence can protect him, but his voice can protect thousands. You don't need a title to demand change, just courage, conviction, and the refusal to look away.